Well, thanks everyone for joining us in this celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Jepson Herbarium. If you were around back in 2000, you may remember that we had our 50th anniversary celebration at the Berkeley campus, but it made more sense to us to hold the 75th celebrations at field stations in the Sierra Nevada, where we could not only get together with one another, but also with the plants in their natural setting. Since this is the spirit that animates the Jepson Herbarium, to basically increase our understanding of the flora and share that with one another, thereby increasing everyone's appreciation of it and hopefully in the process foster its conservation. And we think that these are probably the same kinds of motivations that animated Willis Linn Jepson's career in California botany as our founder. Jepson was born back just after the Civil War in 1867 in the Vaca Valley on the Little Oak Ranch, which is folks that homesteaded after coming across the country by covered wagon in 1855. And his mother recognized at a young age that Jepson was someone who had a great appreciation for natural things. And she tried to foster that in him very successfully, such that by the time he was in high school, he made a trip over to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, one of the leading scientific institutions in California at the time. And he had an opportunity to meet Albert Kellogg, one of the pioneering professional California botanists in California, and also fatefully Edward Lee Green, who would go on to become his mentor at Berkeley. So after meeting with Jepson, Green was hired at Berkeley as the first professor exclusively focused on botany. Jepson entered the class, a class of undergraduates at Berkeley in 1885, and began his studies there, very quickly becoming very focused on floristic botany under Green's influence. And he became a graduate student after he received his undergraduate degree at Berkeley and conducted a floristic study of the greater Bay Area from about the southern boundary of Lake and Mendocino counties down south to about as far as the Pajaro River and east about as far as Sacramento, the area that he called Western Middle California, and we could think of as kind of the greater Bay Area. That dissertation that was filed in 1898 became a publication 3 years later, a book, A Flora of Western Middle California, which is a very mature effort on Jepson's part for a PhD student. He has a very mature taxonomic and floristic sensibility that you can see in those treatments. And you can see here on the cover of the book, this beautiful embossed set of calycanthus or spice bush receptacles. These photographs were taken while Jepson was a graduate student at Berkeley when he conducted extensive field work in Northern California. Collecting was a huge part of his philosophy, a big part of his effort in botany, and that really made his botany what it was. Jepson also, during this time, got very deeply involved in conservation. And when he was only 25 years old, became one of the founders of the Sierra Club with John Muir in San Francisco. And other conservation activities, of which there were numerous, included becoming a founder of the Save the Redwoods League later, which went on to have such an important role, pivotal role in saving major groves of coast redwoods and giant sequoias in California. And he stayed on the executive council of the Save the Redwoods League until his death. So Jepson, shortly after finishing his PhD, became a professor at UC Berkeley, and he had an amazingly productive first decade as a professor there. And you can see a photo of him here in the Sierra Nevada in 1911. These photos of Jepson, I should mention, are from our archives. I'll mention more in a moment. he's smiling, as he well should, because he just published a series of masterworks in California botany that really put him on the map as a major contributor to North American botanical understanding. First, I want to mention A Flora of California. This was a lifelong effort by Jepson, and I'm not kidding. He published the last volume in 1943, only 3 years before his death. He died at the age of 79 in 1946. Unfortunately, he never completed this project. The last installment, which he called Scrophulariaceae to Compositae, remained unpublished at the time of his death, was never completed. This was a major disappointment to him, but it also in part motivated him to set aside the endowment that would create the Jepson Herbarium in his will. And it's not surprising that he didn't finish it, because Jepson's philosophy about floristics was that a flora isn't a flora unless it's essentially a monographic quality. So each of the species treated within this flora have extensive citations for herbarium specimens, elaborate descriptions, in addition to other notes and information. So this is an extensive effort, with the first volume published in 1909. The second volume included legumes, and you can see this beautiful cover of a screwbean mesquite from that volume, with the banner around the base of the screwbean mesquite reading Res Desertorum Mira, the wonders of the desert. So Jepson was very much interested in desert plants and was a major contributor to desert botany, as we'll get back to. Also, in the same year, 1909, Jepson published his Magnificent Trees of California, which is a very small, little, large pocket-sized book, let's say, that included beautiful plates of trees of the state and fairly detailed descriptions, as well as keys to identification. It's a beautiful little book that was really very sufficient for identification and appreciation of the trees in the field. And recently, Michael Kaufman and Matt Ritter published a Trees of California book of their own this year, and have a piece online about Jepson's Trees of California and how it motivated their project. The following year, in 1910, Jepson published The Silva of California, which is a coffee table sized book, a massive work that also is on the trees of California, but much more extensive descriptions and citations of specimens. The back part of the book is full of photographic and artistic plates that really add greatly to the value of this work, not only as a monument to the plants, but also to California history. The photo of the book shown here is one of two copies of this gilded printing. The other copy was presented to Teddy Roosevelt when he visited Berkeley campus on Charter Day in 1911. It was presented to him by the chancellor, but provided by Jepson. And so this is these accomplishments in those 2 years, 1909, 1910, show just how much Jepson was able to accomplish early on as a professor. And this sequoiadendron print here is an example of these magnificent prints. He was not an artist himself, but he definitely chose people with great talent to help him with his work when it came to producing artistic works for his publications. And I'll get back to that. So a few years later, Jepson became the first president of the California Botanical Society. And this society was founded to try to increase appreciation for the California flora as a major outlet for scientific research on California and Western North American botany. And Jepson also handled manuscripts for the journal for many years, in addition to serving as its first president. And in that first issue shown here, Jepson is quoted as saying botany should not be the property of a small cult or a select few, getting across his overall philosophy that the understanding that's acquired in botany should be shared widely with the world, which is something that also was a major impetus for founding the Jepson Herbarium as well. So Jepson had many projects, and he also realized the importance of reaching students. He was a great teacher as an undergraduate instructor at Berkeley, and he realized that there should be floristic works for students even at the high school level, and produced a high school flora for California in the mid-1930s, which is not too long after this photo was taken in his Berkeley office, another photo from our archives. And he also produced a book on economic plants of California for agriculture undergraduates that shows his interest also in fostering understanding of economic plants, not just wild plants. But the book that he's best known for is Jepson's Manual, a manual of the flowering plants of California, published 100 years ago this year in 1925. So this is another reason for us to celebrate, is this is the first publication of a comprehensive guide to the vascular plants of California within one set of covers. And this is a book that stood the test of time, holding sway for 34 years as the main floristic manual for California vascular plants until Munz's California Flora was published in 1959. And in this book, Jepson walks a tightrope between different competing taxonomic philosophies. At the time, his mentor, Edward Lee Green, was quite a splitter taxonomically. Jepson was not. Jepson had a taxonomic philosophy closer to Asa Gray's, which he describes in great detail in the introduction to this book. And he also talks about how his taxonomic philosophy was also shaped by an examination of a multitude of herbarium specimens and an extensive immersion in field botany, which is something that allowed him to better understand whether the variation he was seeing in nature and the variation among collections represents variation within what should be considered a single taxon or variation that represents different taxa. But he also recognized that his taxonomy was something that wouldn't probably stand the test of time, because as more scientific research was performed, understanding would change necessarily, that this was really a progress report, and that, as this quote indicates that I took out of the introduction, he was very open and accepting of the notion that taxonomists should be very open to changing their taxonomies as new information from scientific research dictates that the evolutionary groupings need to be considered, and not some old stale taxonomy that doesn't actually represent what new evidence indicates are the real evolutionary groupings. And even Marcus Jones, one of the most difficult individuals, I should say, in the history of California botany, praised Jepson's manual and said that it did really warrant being the standard, and it would be for a long time. He appreciated, even though he didn't like Jepson personally. He didn't like most of California botanists. But in any case, this is Jepson's 1925 manual with this iconic Calochortus pulchellus on the cover, this Art Deco style 1925 image that remains our logo today. So Jepson's collections, as I mentioned, were vast. There were 27,571 numbered collections by Jepson at the time of his death. Not all of them were made in California, but most of them were. And you can see about half of them here plotted out on a map of California from the Consortium of California Herbaria georeferenced records. And you can see that he got around. He managed to reach parts of California that weren't easy to reach by horseback or by buggy or Model T Ford, which was his means of conveyance for much of his career. And this really became the nucleus of the Jepson Herbarium. He pulled his own collections aside beginning around 1905, very early in his career, and built up his own personal herbarium early throughout his entire career, not only from his own collections, but others that were provided to him as well. And he realized that even though his published floras would eventually be out of date, that his collections never would be, and that the botanists would always want to come back to those collections, as this quote indicates. What we hear less about are the influence of Jepson's graduate students, or the graduate students at Berkeley that were highly influenced by him, even if Jepson didn't serve as the major advisor. And I just want to spend a little time going through these folks because they're so notable. And you've probably heard of at least some of these people before. First, in the upper left, Harvey Monroe Hall. Hall was one of Jepson's early PhD students, and he went on to become a professor at Berkeley. And he also went on to become the major professor of David D. Keck, who's shown in that upper row as well, fourth from the left. I mentioned Keck because Keck factors importantly in Hall's legacy, as I want to talk about in a moment here. But Hall did his dissertation on the composity of Southern California. It's a major work, still of importance, following Jepson's criteria for what a flora really should be. In this case, it's a monographic work of the composites. But he became very intrigued by variation in plants and whether that variation in nature represented, for example, within what we'd call widespread species, represented phenotypic plasticity, that is non-heritable variation that's just due to the influence of the environment in which the plant found itself, or whether it's due to heritable variation, represents potential evidence of local adaptation to differing environments. And so Hall engaged in some of the earliest reciprocal transplant studies, growing plants in common garden environments in their natural environments, and transplanting plants from those natural plots into each other's plots, and seeing what the consequences of that was for those plants' phenotypes or their overall morphology. And this is a very powerful method that went along with other methods that Hall helped to pioneer in experimental taxonomies, it's sometimes called, or ecological systematics. So Harvey Monroe Hall was hired by the Carnegie Institution of Washington at Stanford, and he began to assemble a team to engage in these field studies. And he hired David Keck, who had been his graduate student. And he also hired Bill Heisey from another Berkeley PhD, a physiologist. They went on to work on these transplant plots that they set up at Stanford and across the state, an east-west transect running up the west slope of the Sierra Nevada with an important station at Mather at mid-elevation, and then one at Timberline just above Saddlebag Lake and below Mount Conness, north of Tioga Pass, the area that's now called the Harvey Monroe Hall Natural Area, in recognition of the important work that was done there. Hall also hired the geneticist, the Danish geneticist Jens Clausen, to join the team, and they became the Hall, Clausen, Keck, and Heisey team. But unfortunately, Hall died 4 months later after Clausen was hired of an illness he contracted while on a trip to Washington, D.C., only in his 50s. And the team went on to do the work that Hall laid out in their experimental ecological and evolutionary biological efforts, and became the Claus and Keckenheisy team that's so well known today as pioneers in the area of biosystematics. Helen Gilkey, just next to Hall there, was a mycologist and a botanist. She was actually a student of William Setchell, who was a phycologist primarily at Berkeley. But Jepson also had a major influence on Dr. Gilkey, who became an expert in truffles and who went on to become a professor at Oregon Agricultural College and an important contributor to mycology. She also was an amazing botanical illustrator and artist, and she contributed importantly to Jepson's manual, his 1925 manual, in terms of the beautiful illustrations that are part of that effort. So she and Jepson worked together in that effort. Alice Otley was a student of Jepson's, a PhD student who went on to become a professor at Willis Linn College and an expert in the American members of what at the time was called the genus Lotus, the American members now being in the genera Acmaspon and Hosakia. And the genus Ottlea is sometimes still recognized as a segregate genus in that group of plants. I should mention there's also a genus Gilkea of truffles named for Helen Gilkea, and I named a genus Harmonia for Hall, Harmonia being for Harvey Monroe, and the type species is Harmonia hallii. It's a group of tarweeds. Tarweeds were a major focus of Hall and the Claus and Keckenheisy team. So Alice Otley did a lot of botanical work internationally as well as in North America. She was an important early collector in Africa, among her other botanical efforts. David Keck, in addition to working with the Claus and Keckenheisy team, was an important taxonomist, a pioneer in a lot of ways in California botany. He worked with Munns, actually, late in his career, with in Munns's publication of a California flora. And he was an expert in tarweeds, in addition to a lot of other groups, including penstemon, one of our more diverse genera in Western North America. And the genus Kekiella is named in his honor, a woody segregate of penstemon. Robert F. Hoover, to the right of Keck there, was Jepson's last PhD student. And Jepson said that he was his best PhD student. Hoover did his dissertation on patterns of endemism in the Great Valley of California. This is at a time when there was still some much more sizable remnants of Central Valley flora than exist today after much more conversion of the area to agricultural use. And Hoover's dissertation is an important contribution to understanding of that flora at a critical time before much of it disappeared. He went on to become a professor at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, where the Hoover Herbarium is named in his honor. There's also a genus Hooveria that was recently described as a segregate of Chlorogalum for the purple amoles. Hoover published the first flora of San Luis Obispo County, one of the more diverse counties of California, one of the more diverse floras, I should say, county floras. And David Keel, who's one of the Jepson editors, recently revised that flora that was just published in the last couple of years as Keel and Hoover. At the lower left is John Thomas Howell, who a major California botanist, was one of Jepson's PhD students, or I should say one of Jepson's graduate students. And he went on to become a researcher at the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden for a brief period before he moved to the California Academy of Sciences, where he worked extensively with Alice Eastwood. They were a major botanical team there, and he became a major contributor to understanding of the flora of California in many parts of the flora. He published a flora of Marin County that's gone through multiple editions. He also worked with others on a flora of Sonoma County, as well as flora of Monterey County, flora of San Francisco itself, and flora of Lassen Volcanic National Park, among other areas. He was a major expert on the flora of the Sierra Nevada and made extensive collections there. And there's a Howell Chair of Botany at the California Academy of Sciences that Sarah Jacobs currently holds, that he set aside in his will. Howell was also the first person to articulate the boundaries, the phytogeographic significance of the California floristic province back in 1957. It's a major important contribution in California botany. Herbert Mason, to the right of Howell there, was another Jepson student who became a professor of botany at Berkeley after he finished and spent his entire career at Berkeley. From a conservation standpoint, it's important to note that he also was one of the involved in founding, one of the founders of the East Bay Regional Parks District. As a botanist, he made many contributions. He was the author of a Flora of the Marshes of California, and he made important contributions to our understanding of what's called edaphic endemism, the importance of harsh soils as an area promoting endemism in plants, and articulated the serpentine syndrome very clearly for the first time, with serpentine being substrate that accounts for only about 1% of the surface area of California, but about 10% of the endemic plants of California. And up until Mason's work, it wasn't articulated as well why serpentine was so important as a substrate fostering endemism. Mary Bowerman was a PhD student of Jepson's and did her dissertation on the flora of Mount Diablo. This was published shortly after her dissertation was filed, and she spent the rest of her life dedicated to the preservation of the Mount Diablo region, and was a major figure in saving Mount Diablo in the local area, and was involved in the 1990s in a new revised edition of her Flora of Mount Diablo, working with Barbara Erder, and lived well into her 90s, working hard both in floristic botany as well as conservation of the East Bay. And she set aside an endowment in the Jepson Herbarium in her will to foster additional research on the flora of the East Bay. Joseph Ewan was a Jepson graduate student who went on to become a professor at Tulane after being a researcher at the Smithsonian, and is well known as a major contributor not only to botany itself, but also to the history of natural historians in North America. A very scholarly guy that made major contributions to understanding of botany and botanists in North America. And finally, Lincoln Constance, in this slide, I want to talk about, because he was a Jepson PhD student, did his dissertation on Eriophyllum, the woolly sunflowers, and the genus Constantia was named in his honor, a group that that's based on the species Eriophyllum navinii, which he considered beautifully distinct from other members of the genus Eriophyllum, and which we found was actually fell outside the genus and deserved to bear Lincoln's name. So Lincoln did a lifetime of extensive work on the very difficult family Apiaceae, the Umbelliferae, and became, with Mildred Mathias, two of the world experts on the family worldwide. Extremely diverse, extremely complicated family. This is a family that the great American botanist Asa Gray, in famous correspondence, said he didn't want to have anything more to do with because it was so difficult. But Lincoln and Mildred Mathias made major advances in research understanding of that family. And he's shown here before he started graduate school in the 1920s as a ranger at Crater Lake National Park. And you can see the lodge there in the background. So here's Jepson in the left here, shortly before he died in the mid-1940s. And the herbarium was established 4 years after Jepson's death in 1946 with a mission to focus on the native and naturalized vascular plants of California. And the mission is here paraphrased from the will of Jepson's, to understand and conserve the California flora through systematic floristic and conservation biology studies, and to communicate knowledge of the flora through publications and instructional programs. The instructional programs part is something that was added on in the 1990s, as I'll talk about in a moment, but as a natural extension of the mission as Jepson conceived it. And originally, the herbarium was housed separately in the Valley Life Sciences, or at that time, the Life Sciences building on campus. But upon renovation of the Life Sciences building, the original or university herbarium and the Jepson herbarium became co-housed in a common space, even though the specimens are kept in separate folders and the curators have separate titles oftentimes within one herbarium or the other. And endowments are often restricted to one or the other, including the Jepson endowment. And I think I know Jepson would be very pleased that the management of his collection is in such able hands as it currently is with our collection management staff, which is quite lean, but incredibly effective and dedicated. And I want to call out Anna Penny in particular here, who's been working with the collection for many, many years and who does an amazing job with all aspects of collection management, including mentoring volunteers and students in the management of the collection as well. I also want to call out Saskia Rather, who's actually managing the phycological collection of the university herbarium, but also reaches over to help Anna in critical respects. For example, recently involved in databasing, imaging quite a few of our tree specimens in both the university and Jepson herbaria. So thanks very much to both Anna and Saskia for their efforts. So Jepson's herbarium is not just the collections of plants that Jepson accumulated and have been accumulated over time since then. Jepson also had an amazing library, and he had an amazing archive of resources, including his own correspondence. He basically never threw anything away. He saw himself as a man of destiny, and he kept all of his effects, which were part of this overall original gift to the university. And what we see here on the left is this incredibly well-curated catalog and now compactorized collection since the mid-90s, thanks to the efforts of our librarian and archivist, Amy Casimir, who's been working on this effort, among many other things that she does, for decades now. And I also want to call out Dick Beidelman, who's now deceased, but who spent his retirement at the Jepson Herbarium, helping to take on this mammoth task with the archives and also studying the archives very carefully. He was quite a scholar. If you ever had a chance to read the book California's Frontier Naturalists, published by UC Press, it's a very worthwhile read of the Western tradition in botany in California and other naturalists, not just botanists, through time from the earliest explorers up until about the early 1900s. He also published a beautiful biographical piece about Willis Linn Jepson in the 50th anniversary of the Jepson Herbarium Madronio special issue in 2000, if you can get a hold of that. But the two of these folks really, we have a lot to be grateful for about managing this amazing collection. There's been a board of trustees of the Jepson Herbarium since its inception. It originally included Lincoln Constance, who was Jepson's successor as professor of botany at Berkeley, Helen Mar Wheeler, later Helen Mar Beard, who was the executor of Jepson's will, and Alva Davis, who was chairman of botany at the time the herbarium was established. And this is a self-perpetuating body that has numbered 11 individuals since the herbarium was founded, who are all shown here. The current members of the board are Beth Burnside, John Taylor, Tom White, and David Ackerley. And the mandate of the trustees is to ensure that the resources of the Jepson Endowment are spent in the way that it was intended toward California floristics. And we've been really grateful to the members of the board for their guidance over the years. And I've been fortunate to know all of these folks, except for Helen Mar Beard and Alva Davis, who died before I became curator of the Jepson Herbarium. So the first curator of the Jepson Herbarium in 1950, when it was established, which Lincoln, as I mentioned, had a big role in helping to ensure, was Remo Bacigalupi, that went by the name Batch, a nickname that everyone called him. And he served for 18 years until 1968. He became curator fairly late in his career overall. He was a native Californian, born in San Francisco, and he had a distinguished education, Harvard PhD, and a great expert on the California flora. He knew every back road in California. He collected extensively and helped to build up the Jepson collection to a great extent. And he was instrumental in finding some important discoveries of new species, such as Lithophragma maximum, which he described from the Southern Channel Islands. And there were a number of species named for him that he discovered but did not describe, including Downingia bacigalupii, Paradiridia bacigalupii, and a tarweed that I named for him, Deonandra bacigalupii, where he, on an annotation label, indicated that it didn't match any described species of Hemizonia, which was the genus at the time that Deonandra was classified within. So he didn't have his own graduate students. He wasn't a professor, but he was a very important mentor to PhD students and other students at Berkeley, taking folks into the field for the very first time often and showing them the ropes in field botany and telling them about important places where the plants they were interested in studying grew. So he had a major role in education and outreach. And he was also a lifelong conservationist. He was a member of the Sierra Club for 71 years. I had an opportunity to meet him only one time near the end of his life in his 90s. Had a really enjoyable conversation with him in 1994, just before I took over as Jepson Curator in that year. I also want to talk about Laura Mae Dempster, who was a student of Jepson's that I want to talk about separately from the others I mentioned, because she not only was such a significant botanist, but she also worked in the Jepson Herbarium. So Laura Mae, who I had the pleasure of getting to know when I first came to Berkeley, she was in her 90s at the time, but was still quite active and driving in every day to Berkeley from her home in Orinda. She did her master's thesis on Lepidium in the Cruciferae or Brassicaceae. And Jepson, upon presenting her with her degree, said that he wished it could have been a PhD because she deserved it. But she was in a master's program, but her work was so fine that she became his assistant. And eventually, she and her husband left California, but eventually came back and came back to the Bay Area. And Batch, the first curator of the Jepson Herbarium I just introduced, hired Laura May to work on unfinished business in the herbarium. And she actually published the only fascicle of Jepson's A Flora of California that was ever published by anyone other than Jepson after his death. And it was on the Rubiaceae of California, which is a family that she knew better than anyone else. She was an expert in Galium and described many new taxa in Galium that have stood the test of time, including Galium serpenticum, shown here. She also was an expert in Plectritis in the Valerianaceae, published on Caprifoliaceae, and had an extensive knowledge of Lewisia as well, this beautiful genus in the Montiaceae, and described this particular taxon, for example, here, Lewisia collagii, subspecies Hutchinsonii. The second curator of the Jepson Herbarium was Larry Heckard, who served from 1968 until his untimely death in 1991. Larry brought a whole new arsenal of methods to the Jepson Herbarium for studying plant relationships. So Larry was trained in biosystematics and was an excellent cytogeneticist. He did excellent chromosome work, as you can see from this camera lucida drawing here from one of his publications. He was a great microscopist in general, and you can see this SEM photo here of a seed coat wall, for example. So he brought a lot of microscopic characters to bear on his systematics, which was important because he worked in very difficult plant groups, including a polyploid complex in Phacelia, as well as the complex subtribe Castellani that includes the paintbrushes and other groups like the bird's beaks, Cordylanthus, and owl's clovers, Orthocarpus, etc. And through his work and the work of collaborators of his, they were able to come to an entirely new understanding of the relationships within this subtribe Castellani. And in the year that he died in 1991, he and Chuang published a revision of the subtribe in which they present the morphological evidence for a realignment of the taxa in the subtribe into new generic circumscriptions and genera. So this was something that was quite radical at the time, but was subsequently corroborated with molecular phylogenetic evidence by David Tank, who worked on this group, has worked on this group since then, with Cordylanthus being subsequently broken up into a couple more groups that Larry recognized. It's infrageneric rank. So you can see here, for example, that he also was very interested in the natural history of the plants that he studied and actually did experimental growth studies, for example, of Castellea and its host plants. You can see the parasite root here of Castellea with a host root, these hostorial connections that he studied. He also was an extensive collector in California, described species from a number of different groups, such as Chivac's monkey flower here and Shetler's harebell in the Campanulaceae. Relatively late in Larry's career, Carol and Jim Hickman moved to Berkeley, where Carol became a professor of paleontology and later integrative biology. And Jim, her husband, was a plant ecologist. Jim didn't come with a position, but aligned himself with the Herbaria at Berkeley. And he and Larry struck up a friendship. that resulted in a collaboration on the flora and phytogeographic affinities of Snow Mountain, one of the high peaks of the southern North Coast ranges, in an area that was very underexplored botanically. It's now part of a national monument designated by Obama, the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. And here you can see Larry Heckard with his backpack and collecting gear on one of their trips into this remote wilderness area where they did this study. And what they quickly found was that Munza's California flora was not adequate to identify many of the plants that they were encountering there. And they realized that the time was ripe for a new floristic manual for California, and eventually decided this is something that they should take on within the Jepson Herbarium with Jim Hickman in the lead. And so they did. They founded the Jepson Manual Project in 1982, and the Friends of the Jepson Herbarium was founded during this period, as was the Jepson Globe, which continues to be published as our newsletter. And in 1993, the Jepson Manual Higher Plants of California was published, involving about 300 authors as contributors of treatments, and was a major achievement in California botany. But unfortunately, Larry Heckard died 2 years before it was published in 1991, and Jim Hickman died around the time of publication, also prematurely in 1993. So the Jepson Herbarium was quite bereft in the early 90s, even though this major accomplishment had occurred. Brent Mischler was hired as the director of the University of Jepson Herbarium in 1993, at the time, the same year as the publication of the Jepson Manual, and realized that the momentum of the Jepson Manual project with all the authors and supporters was something that should continue in order to continue to make progress in California floristics. I was hired a year later in 1994 as the Jepson Curator and also a professor in integrated biology. And the Flora Project, the Jepson Flora Project, was founded in that year. The editors, a group of editors was assembled to continue floristic work. And these were Steve Boyd from Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, Barbara Erter from University of Jepson Herbaria, Bob Patterson from San Francisco State University, Tom Rosati from University of Jepson Herbaria, Dieter Wilken, who had been the managing editor of the Jepson Manual Project, and Marguerite Weatherwax as managing editor of the Flora Project. And Dave Keel, shown here, was the author of the family key to families in the Jepson Manual, and the editor of the largest family in the flora and the manual, the Asteraceae, and later became an editor as well of the overall project. So we had a great group of editors, including myself, starting out in this capacity in 1994. And at the same time, in 1994, the Jepson Workshop series was born. And this involved, first off, Susan D'Alcamo, who had been the assistant to Dieter Wilken as the assistant managing editor of the Jepson Manual Project. She shifted her role to become the head of the workshop program and continued working with the Globe on the Jepson Globe. And the workshop program got off to a strong start in the 1990s with a large number of both field and classroom workshops. Dr. Strother and I taught the first one on California compositing in October 94, and it's been in continuous operation ever since then, thanks to Brent as the founder and Susan D'Alcamo as the lead on the whole Jepson Workshop program. So when Susan retired and Stacy received her PhD after working on a dissertation on Lysingea in my lab, she became, with Betsy Ringrose, co-coordinators of the Jepson workshop program, with Betsy in an administrative role and Stacy as the workshop on the ground workshop coordinator. Betsy moved on to other higher administrative positions after that, and Stacy became our assistant director within the University in Jepson Herbaria, continuing to work closely with workshop coordinators through time, most of whom are shown here in succession as we go from left to right, with Nina down in the lower left here being our current 50% workshop coordinator. We also had a number of assistants from Edith, Roxanne, and currently Avery Ligon that have been involved in this very successful program. And I should mention, Stacy's now the associate director of the Herbaria and has had continuing to have a major role, not just in helping in the higher level coordination of the workshops, but also being the on-the-ground coordinator at times, with many times alongside Nina, trading off with Nina. So Stacy's had her hand in this now for many, many years. And we're grateful to Stacy for all of her contributions, and to Nina and all of our work, and Avery and all of our past and present coordinators and assistants for the workshop program. And we're very grateful to our instructors who've been so important to the quality of instruction that we've been able to give over the years in the workshop program. We've been really blessed to have top experts in the floras of particular areas, particular experts in groups of plants, experts in major botanical topics, be involved in this program, which, in addition to really wonderful participants across all of our workshops. We're really grateful to all of our participants and our instructors. So getting back to the Flora project, in '93, as I mentioned, the manual was published, the '93 manual. And at that time, I was hired a year later, and the first kind of effort that seemed to make the most sense at that time in the mid '90s were regional manuals, where we could treat the flora on a smaller scale, which would aid in identification and also in carrying around, the floristic manual in the field. We could have a much smaller book. And being a great desert enthusiast myself, the area where I first became interested in botany in a big way, and kind of honoring Jepson's great interest in desert botany that I mentioned earlier, it made a lot of sense to carve out the southeastern deserts as an area for a separate regional manual. It is such a distinctive phytogeographical region in California, and there hadn't been a comprehensive book on the flora of the California, the vascular flora of the southeastern California deserts up to that time. It's also an area where you want something very portable and light, doesn't take up too much room in your backpack because of the heat and the lack of water out there. You want to have a light load, and what you do carry should mostly be H2O. So this effort was finished in the year 2002. And at that time, we realized that it made sense. What made the most sense at that point was to go ahead and publish a new Jepson manual, statewide manual, because the 1990s into the early 2000s was a revolutionary period in plant systematics that saw the widespread adoption of DNA sequencing to look at relationships in organisms in general, which led to a massive reorganization of plant families, plant genera, and even species. There also been quite a lot of field discovery during that time as well, such that the book was very much in need of revision. So on the left is the original crew, the in-house crew, not counting our outside editors and contributors, of which there were hundreds. But this is the group within the Jepson Herbarium that set out to start this effort in 2003 when this photo was taken. I want to call out Jeff Greenhouse in the lower left, major contributor to the Jepson, and to the Jepson manual revision, who had a great interest in nomenclature during our revision project and contributed greatly in updating nomenclature for the book. Tom Rosati on the right, a veteran of the first project, the Jepson Manual project from 82 to 93, who brought a lot of expertise from that time and who was a key partner working on this as co-scientific editors in-house. Really valued Tom's scientific editorship, sharing in that role with him. And in the back row on the right, Stacy Marcos, as I mentioned, already working extensively with the Jepson Flora project, in addition to her efforts with the workshop program. Marguerite Weatherwax, again, as our managing editor, and Dick Moe, our IT guru, who was able to accomplish miracles for us that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but really important for helping us get the project completed from that standpoint. Scott Simono in the upper right came on board a bit later, making major contributions to the effort. And Rob Preston, who was a graduate student, same time I was at UC Davis in the 1980s. I knew him to be a floristic expert and a good taxonomist. And we contracted him to help us with many treatments, which was a great help. And again, as I mentioned, involving hundreds of authors and a number of family editors as well, that it led us to publish the revised Jepson manual in 2012, which we realized, that wave of progress in plant systematics and understanding of relationships of plants did not abate after we started this project. So by the time the book came out in 2012, parts of it were already out of date. And we decided that going forward, it made a whole lot more sense to revise the flora incrementally as needed on a year-to-year basis. And so at the same time, the manual came out, which was in early 2012. You can see our book signing there at the CNPS meeting in early 2012 in San Diego. We also put online the Jepson e-Flora, which started as the text of the Jepson manual and has been updated every year since then, at least once, which allows for us to track changes as they occur in understanding, and which is really important because a lot of the species that are new to science, there's a continual stream of new species being described in California, which are endangered upon description oftentimes. I mean, there's a good reason that they were only described recently in general. They're often quite rare. And so we need those plants to be readily identifiable within keys as soon as possible. So that's one of our many motivations. Another motivation was that the Jepson e-Flora would allow for linkage with online georeferenced specimens to populate range maps, very much in line with Jepson's philosophy about what a flora really is in the first place, that it really needs to be combined with actual herbarium specimens. And I should note that the consortium of California Herbaria that allowed this to be done was a partnership that began in 2003, the same year we started a revision of the Jepson manual, and that was made possible through a grant from the California Digital Library. They gave a grant to the Jepson Herbarium that was sizable enough that we were able to spread the money around a bit to other herbaria in California and forge partnerships that just expanded from there to almost all the herbaria in California now, and even some herbaria outside California now serve Californian specimens through our portals in the Consortium of California Herbaria. And the consortium now serves about 4 million records. So it's a major resource that's helped to bring together all of these invaluable collections at institutions throughout California and beyond, and to help to better understand the flora of the state and the floras that are represented throughout all the collections of the herbaria in California. Also, an electronic resource that was developed after the Jepson manual was published are the Jepson videos on YouTube, on our YouTube channel in the Jepson Herbarium. And this is something that started later than the eFlora, but again, and Stacy Marcos really gets credit for initiating this project. These are short vignettes on different native and naturalized plants of California, which grew to be quite a library during the pandemic when we couldn't get together individually, but we could get out in the field and make these videos, and which brought a whole new audience into the fold for the Jepson Herbarium. And it's been an important outreach tool for us as well. So the current Jepson eFlora staff are shown here. I continue to serve as the convening editor, even though I retired a couple of years ago. And Nina is 50% managing editor of the Jepson eFlora and 50% Jepson workshop coordinator. And she does both of these jobs incredibly well. And I'm very grateful to Nina. It's really accelerated our progress on revising parts of the flora that need revision. Jason Alexander, over in the upper left, is our biodiversity informatics manager, taking over the role that was held earlier by Dick Moe and David Baxter after him. And he's critical for maintaining the eFlora's web presence and making the eFlora happen online, along with all of its associated resources, and as well as the linkage with the Consortium of California Herbaria in the Index of California Plant Names. So we're really grateful to Jason. Avery Ligon is our assistant within the Jepson Herbarium that has her hands in all kinds of activities, including the Jepson eFlora. We're very grateful to Avery. And again, Stacy Marcos is the associate director of the University in Jepson Herbaria and is heavily involved in the Jepson eFlora, especially in planning and helping us guide a path forward, but also in the day-to-day operations. So we're a lean but very effective team, and I'm really grateful to be part of it. We also are exceedingly grateful to our authors who do extensive work that's painstaking, that also is not very visible. The rewards are somewhat intangible, but we celebrate these individuals as part of our 75th anniversary, as well as really being in the front lines of California floristics in ways that matter most. So thank you to all of our authors as well. And since the Jepson eFlora came online in 2012, we've added 227 new native taxa to the eFlora, including range extensions, but also taxa new to science, as well as taxa that are newly recognized but not new to science, although they might represent novel circumscriptions that bear an older published name that represents a name of a specimen that falls within those circumscriptions, so it has to be used for that novel taxon. And sometimes fully resurrected taxa are also brought out of mothballs, and new data recognizes that they need to be accepted taxa. 36 new naturalized taxa have also been brought into the eFlora since then, as well as 7 new waifs. And we have a large revision we're working on this year as well. So in-house research has always been a part of the Jepson Herbarium by the curator. First of all, Batch and Larry also had major research programs, as I mentioned. My own curatorial research is focused mostly on the native compositae of California, as well as compositae of Hawaii that descend from Californian ancestors like the Hawaiian silver swords. But in general, California compositae has been my primary focus, and that's a large area of diversity that it's been really exciting to work with. Also, the genus Collinsia and the Plantaginaceae, a family that used to be treated in the same family that Larry Heckard worked in the Scrophulariaceae. I've been lucky to work in that group, very exciting group to work in from a number of standpoints with collaborators, Scott Armbruster, Susan Kalis, and others. Made a lot of fun discoveries in primarily Californian genus that shows a lot of evolutionary dynamism. As far as broader topics in the flora, after the Jepson revision was published, I was interested in revisiting origins and relationships of the California flora, which was a fun project published in Annual Review of Ecology, Systematics in Ecology and Evolution. And Brent Mischler, David Ackerley, and I had a grant together that Brent spearheaded on called the California Plant Phylodiversity Project that resulted in a number of publications using novel approaches and metrics to look at patterns of richness and endemism in the California flora and trying to help identify priority areas for conservation that were underprotected but bear extraordinary phyloendemism that needs protection. So there's a number of projects that we published through the teens, late teens especially, that were part of that effort. And in retirement, I'm continuing my research in the California compositae. There have been a number of Jepson-affiliated PhD students at Berkeley since the mid-1990s. You can see photos, quite a few of those individuals here. Don't have time to go through all of them, but they've been major contributors to our understanding of California plants. And it was a pleasure to serve as the mentor of many of these students. And their work resulted in advances in understanding, including major revisions of taxonomy of some of the groups shown here, or all of the groups shown here, in addition to others. Both PhD students and postdocs were involved in this work on all of these different groups that are quite fascinating and diverse. So beginning this year, began a transitionary period in the history of the Jepson Herbarium that I want to talk about. Following the retirement of Brent Mischler about a year ago, and the exodus of Lucia Lohman, who was our director for a year, but then took her dream job as president of the Missouri Botanical Garden beginning in January of this year. And so, and I retired, as I mentioned, a couple of years ago. So our current interim director, called back out of retirement, is Keith Gillis, who started in January, who has a history as a professor in forestry and also longtime dean of the College of Natural Resources. Keith has been an incredibly effective interim director and is really helping see us through this period this year, that this kind of transition where we're really not slowing down any of our efforts, but we have a lot of important goals that we need to pursue as we start to repopulate the herbarium. So these are some of the goals that we're all committed to both Keith and Stacy and I and others within the herbarium. First off, hiring of a new herbaria director is a top priority. This is not only a priority of the herbaria, but also of the Department of Integrative Biology, where our previous directors have held faculty titles. And there's a strong possibility that this search will go forward in the coming academic year. And it's definitely at the top priority of Integrative Biology's faculty search list. As soon as a new herbaria director is hired, the search for a new Jepson director can begin to be planned. And that will be an important goal to hire my successor. But before that happens, which is definitely not something that's going to happen in the next year, we'll be hiring new staff positions within the Jepson Herbarium to help Nina and I and Stacy and others, Avery and Jason, with the Jepson Flora project, including Jepson E-Flora and the Index of California plant names, so that we can continue to have yearly revisions of the Jepson E-Flora going forward that don't require quite as much of our core team as we currently put into this effort. There are also a number of goals electronically we want to achieve in the near term. Developing a mobile-friendly E-Flora is a very near-term goal that is going forward. We're also pursuing instructional videos for some of the more challenging plant groups in California, and we have some funding already for this. The first one will be on compositae or Asteraceae that I'm going to put together that will help people to learn the tribes of the family within California and to aid in overall identification, which requires understanding the morphology of the group, and having that tribal orientation can be really valuable in that regard. And getting back to the E-Flora more broadly, we have a goal of parsing the E-Flora into a database to allow for more structured searches based on particular morphological features of the plants, as well as their geographic distributions, habitats, and other characteristics. And we think that this will help us. We're sure that this will help us go forward in advancing our efforts to improve the ease of identification of plants using our resources, possibly in partnership with others. And we're also interested in community input from all of you, your ideas and suggestions about what you think we should be doing as our important community in California floristics. And we really look forward to any of those suggestions that you have. So I want to thank all of our donors and fund providers, the directors and curators of all California herbaria, our authors and editors in the Jepson Flora Project, all of our staff, and the whole California botanical community, including all of you participants in our celebration of the 75th anniversary. And I finally just want to mention this beautiful banner that you see up above here was produced by our artist, Linda Vorobik, who illustrated many of the plants that are illustrated in the Jepson manual, both the 93 and 2012 editions and in the Jepson E-Flora. And this beautiful display here includes plant groups that have been studied fairly recently within the Jepson Herbarium, including Eryngium, Peridotale, Leysingia, Downingia, Plagiobothres, Iris, Dionandra, Castanea, Phacelia, Cicidalcia, Lasthenia, another Downingia, and Sanicula, as well as the iconic Calochortus pulchellus here, Mount Diablo globe lily. So thanks very much, folks, and we look forward to your continued participation and look forward to the next 25 years of celebrating California botany with all of you.